Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. When the Convention of Thorns concluded, those who signed it essentially joined the Camarilla. Those who refused to sign it joined the Sabbat. The former had thought that perhaps they could bring reform and needed change to vampire society from within the Camarilla. Unfortunately, as the centuries ground on, would-be reformer after would-be reformer kept running into a stone wall where the Elders' power and authority lay. And so true change for the better was rapidly considered to be impossible. Through the rest of the Middle Ages and into the Victorian era, it seemed that the cause of the Anarchs, greater justice for the young bloods of society, was going to go nowhere. That all changed with the second Anarch Revolt. And second verse same as the first, the story begins with a Brujah having a dispute with someone in authority. The time was 1943. The place, Los Angeles, California, United States of America. The authority figure in question was the 6th-generation toreador Don Sebastian Juan Dominguez. Embraced in 1870 and therefore only a neonate by Camarilla standards, he was nonetheless made prince of the city, mostly due to the machinations of his powerful sire Christopher Houghton. Like all Camarilla princes, Don Sebastian's primary responsibility was to enforce the masquerade and punish malefactors who breached it. This was especially important as, by the mid-20th century, Southern California had become a hotbed for anarchs, thin bloods, and other dissidents within the Camarilla. Unfortunately, Don Sebastian was pretty mediocre in performing his duties. The only reason that he wasn't ousted from power was the fact that while he sucked at preventing masquerade violations, he was very good at covering them up after the fact. It didn't help that Don Sebastian actually contributed to masquerade violations by feeding in public. As if it wasn't bad enough that the Prince of Los Angeles was just this side of incompetent, he was vindictive, cruel, and arrogant as well. In life, Don Sebastian had been a minor Spanish noble of good blood, and as a result, even in undeath, figured that anyone who also wasn't a Spanish nobleman, that is, everyone else, was beneath him. He was especially contemptuous of vampires who were of non-white ancestry. It seemed that in the prince there combined all the qualities that would make him loathed by the kindred of Los Angeles. Enter the Brujah, a 300-year-old 8th generation from Scotland named Jeremy McNeil. Like most of his clan, McNeil had an inherent disdain for authority and a tendency to root for the underdog. Shortly after arriving in Los Angeles in May of 1943, McNeil swiftly acquainted himself with the many abuses performed under the rule of Don Sebastian. Most egregiously, packs of white toreador harassing and abusing vampires of non-white ancestry with impunity. In typical Brujah fashion, McNeil took up the cause of the victims and petitioned Don Sebastian for an audience. To his own surprise, the prince granted his request. But if Jeremy McNeil had expected a civil and honest discussion on the matter at hand, Don Sebastian quickly disabused him of that notion. After pouring out every possible insult on McNeil's background, the Toreador Prince used a combination of his presence and dominate disciplines to mind control McNeil into getting on all fours and debasing himself before the prince and his court. He then had McNeil bash his head against the floor until it ran with blood and he was almost unconscious. Don Sebastian then had his ghouls drag McNeil away and throw him in an open trash bin. McNeil only barely managed to summon enough strength to close the lid before the sun could rise and put an end to him. Eventually, McNeil gained enough strength to crawl out of the trash bin and make his way to the haven of fellow Brujah and friend Salvador Garcia. McNeil related what happened to his clanmates, though to save himself from personal embarrassment, he altered the story so that he'd been beaten up by Don Sebastian's ghouls. Unsurprisingly, Garcia and the Brujah wanted to fight then and there, but McNeil, in a supreme effort of will for a Brujah, counseled patience. An idealist at heart, he decided to give the powers that be one last chance, convincing Los Angeles' sizable Anarch community to petition the Primogen Council, asking that they stand up to Don Sebastian's abuse of power. Unfortunately, Don Sebastian's abuses had been precisely because he held a lot of power, too much for the Primogen Council to defy him, and so the Anarch's cause was turned down. McNeil hadn't really expected a different outcome, but he had thought it worthwhile to give them a second chance. Now that any hope for a peaceful resolution was off the table, he, Garcia, and his allies began preparing for war. They struck later that same year. They arranged violent demonstrations in the streets and even launched covert attacks on civil rights protesters in an effort to provoke police crackdowns that would in turn provoke mass rioting. It worked like a charm, and LA was convulsed with mass violence. Using the chaos as cover, the Anarchs made their move, hunting down and eliminating every Camarilla authority figure within the city, with Salvador Garcia claiming the honor of killing Don Sebastian supposedly in single combat. Just like that, Los Angeles was no longer a Camarilla city. The second Anarch Revolt had begun. The fall of Don Sebastian came as no surprise to many of his neighboring princes in Southern California. They'd all known that eventually he would go too far and reap the consequences of his arrogance, and so his downfall was mostly greeted with shrugs, good riddance to bad rubbish. But then, the Anarchs in their own cities began revolting. The story of Jeremy McNeil's humiliation by Don Sebastian and the subsequent overthrow of the Prince of Los Angeles spread like wildfire. Just as when Tyler had diablerized Hardestat the Elder at the beginning of the first Anarch Revolt, the Anarchs of Southern California were shown vivid proof that the power of those in authority could be defied. Throughout Southern California, city after city fell into Anarch hands. Those Camarilla elders that weren't killed fled into the night. The southward spread of the Anarch movement only stopped at the Mexican border. Mexico was Sabbat territory, and McNeil was already concerned how the Camarilla would react to his revolt. Provoking the Sabbat and the Camarilla would have been a very unwise move. Meanwhile, the Anarchs failed to make any significant headway in the north of California. This was mostly thanks to the efforts of Vannevar Thomas, the Ventru Prince of San Francisco, who not only wielded immense power, but was also very popular with the kindred of his domain. There would be no mass Anarch uprising to unseat him. Still, the Anarchs had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Nearly half of California, from San Jose to San Diego, belonged to the Anarchs. Realizing that expansion was at an end, McNeil and the other Anarch leaders adopted a policy of consolidation, readying themselves for what they believed was the inevitable Camarilla counterstrike. As it turned out, the Camarilla would be making no serious endeavor against the Anarchs for some time. Their leadership was more concerned with affairs in Europe, as they sought to try and cover up serious masquerade breaches made during World War II and contain the influence of the Soviet Union and its Russian Bruja supporters. Back in Los Angeles, McNeil rejected any idea of taking Don Sebastian's place as prince. Instead, after a long meeting with Salvador Garcia and the other leaders of the revolt, McNeil proclaimed the creation of the Anarch Free State, complete with its own founding manifesto, the Status Perfectus. We, the kindred of the Free State, do hereby declare that we and our progeny, and all kindred who choose freedom over oppression and liberty over tyranny, of all clans and generations, have as an inherent part of their being the spiritual substance called libertas, or free will. We further declare that, as we have freed ourselves from the bonds of mortality, so must we free ourselves from the forces that would rob us of our libertas. Not only must we continue to struggle on our own behalf, but on behalf of our brothers and sisters who continue to be robbed of their libertas by oppression, ignorance, and fear. The Anarch Free State is the political expression of that struggle. In choosing to free ourselves from political tyranny, we have also chose to embrace our own libertas and that of our brother and sister kindred everywhere. For these reasons, we, the kindred of the Anarch Free State, meeting this night in solemn convocation, do hereby pledge ourselves to the following principles. 1. We declare ourselves to be free and independent, owing allegiance to no creature and no organization. 2. We declare our ability to rule ourselves, with no prince, no primogen, and no other ruler other than that which we choose for ourselves. 3. We declare our kinship with oppressed kindred everywhere and offer a home to all kindred of all generations and clans who will agree to dwell in harmony with us. 4. We further accept our responsibility to our oppressed brothers and sisters everywhere and pledge to assist them at all times and in all places in their own struggle for the freedom that we declare to be the birthright of all kindred from now until the end of time. 5. We recognize our responsibility to maintain the masquerade and we pledge to protect and defend it. 6. We establish this status perfectus and recognize its duty to all kindred. With that, the ad hoc Revolutionary Council of the Anarchs dissolved itself, and the kindred of the Anarch Free States were left free to govern themselves. It went about as well as you might expect. It's bad enough when human beings, weak, selfish, and fallible as they are, try to live by such principles. With vampires, whose humanity is already stunted by the transformation into undead and each having their own inner beast clawing for attention, it only took 10 years for McNeil's dream to collapse into ashes. The Anarch Free State dissolved into random gang violence, as various factions formed and then fought with one another incessantly over territory. In the end, McNeil and the senior Anarchs had to step in and redivide the Anarch Free State along the old Camarilla domains, placing in each city a baron, essentially the equivalent of a Camarilla prince. The violence toned down somewhat after that, but it never really went away. And that really is the glaring weakness of the Anarch movement. There is no real sense of unity. In keeping with their principles of freedom and equality, the Anarchs make no distinction based on rank. All kindred have a say, and they all tend to have different ideas about how things should be done. And because vampires are greedy, proud, and willful beings, conflict and its escalation into open violence are commonplace. The other sects have to deal with this kind of problem as well, but they have mechanisms of control that are far more effective. The Camarilla has the iron-fisted rule of its elders, its princes, and of course the inner circle, while the Sabbat is unified by the Vinculum and a fanatical shared sense of common purpose. As chaotic as they often are, the Sabbat can at least be relied on to agree on some things. With the Anarchs, that's never certain. There's a lot more to unpack here philosophically, but that will have to wait until I do a future video on the Brujah clan. As you've seen with figures like Tyler and Jeremy McNeil, this clan has been bound up with the destiny of the Anarch movement for a very long time, indeed since the very beginning. Indeed, between the Convention of Thorns and the end of the 20th century, the vast majority of Anarchs tended to be Brujah. At any rate, much like the office of Prince in the Camarilla, exactly what are the powers of a baron depends on the power and personality of the individual who holds that office. Though of course, as a general rule, barons are far less overbearing than princes or even Sabbat archbishops. The modern Anarch movement mostly agrees with the Camarilla on the importance of the masquerade and the retaining of one's humanity. They just don't like the idea of the Camarilla essentially being a gerontocracy, where the older you are, the more power you have by default. Under the Baron, you have 3 offices, each with a very specific purpose. The Emissaries, who essentially serve as ambassadors to the Sabbat and the Camarilla and are thus in charge of negotiations between them and the Anarchs. The Sweeper, who is technically similar to a sheriff, but because the Anarchs generally rely upon their own members to police themselves with regards to the masquerade, a Sweeper functions more like a census taker than a law enforcement officer. His or her primary job is to know how many vampires are within a specific Anarch domain and who they are. And finally, the Chameleons, who are essentially spies working for the Anarchs embedded within the other sects. Some Chameleons are even successful enough to rise to positions of importance within the Camarilla or the Sabbat. Alas, for the founders of the Anarch Free State, the remainder of the 20th century was one long series of disappointments. The Anarch baronies could be relied on to come together in the face of a common enemy. For example, they managed to repel a Sabbat crusade in 1965. But the instant the crisis was over, the Anarchs would go back to squabbling and fighting among themselves. Seeing how dysfunctional the Anarchs had become, the Camarilla, for the most part, decided to simply sit and keep an eye on things. They figured that the way things were going, eventually the Anarch Free State would fall apart completely and they could just swoop in and resume control. But then, in 1998, a new variable entered the game. Large numbers of East Asian vampires, calling themselves Kuei Jin, began to muscle in on the Bay Area. Highly organized and skilled in manipulation, they actually managed to take over San Francisco from the Camarilla and then began inflaming tensions between the Anarch baronies until they broke out into open war. At which point the Kuei Jin essentially played divide and conquer and began swallowing up Anarch territory. They failed to take Los Angeles, but they were successful in ousting Jeremy McNeil and many of the founding members of the Anarch Free State. This final blow proved to be too much, and the beginning of the 20th century would see the final collapse of the Anarch Free State. It looked as though, just as with the first Anarch Revolt, the second was to fizzle out and end in miserable failure. But then, fickle fortune began to swing the other way. In 1999, seemingly out of nowhere, the gangrel Justicar Xavier announced that his clan was defecting from the Camarilla. At first, no one knew what to make of this. The gangrel had always been a close-mouthed and individualistic clan. Not nearly as fiery as the Brujah, but they'd always had their own independent streak. Then came 2012 and the Conclave of Prague. With the Second Inquisition on the rise and advancements in technology allowing humans to get ever more closer to discovering the terrible truth that vampires are indeed real, the Anarchs, who were still considered part of the Camarilla by the Camarilla, attended Prague to try and discuss what to do. In the midst of the arguments that tried to be discussions but never really succeeded, Theo Bell, Brujah Archon, suddenly burst in and killed several Camarilla leaders, mostly from the Ventru clan, including Hardestat the Younger, one of the original founders of the sect. With that act of violence, the Brujah formally announced their defection from the Camarilla to the Anarch Movement. 14 years after the collapse of the Anarch Free State, the Anarch Movement has gone from the lowest of lows to possibly the highest of highs. Besides clans Gangrel and Brujah, the Anarchs have received a boost in membership from the previously independent clan, the followers of Set, now renamed the Ministry, and many young Semitzi who have defected from the Sabbat. Once confined to Southern California, the Anarch Movement now spreads across the United States and is even swallowing up formerly Camarilla territory in Europe. At this rate, the Anarchs might actually supplant the Sabbat as the Camarilla's great antagonist. Certainly, Theo Bell's killing of several Ventru at Prague have effectively sundered any connections the two factions may once have had. Indeed, immediately after Prague, Clan Ventru urged the Camarilla to declare war upon the Anarch Movement. Of course, the Camarilla still retain 5 of the original 7 clans and have gained new members from the La Sombra and Banu Hakim, so they remain the largest, most dominant faction in vampire society. But hey, who doesn't love a good underdog story? Certainly the Anarchs have never been averse to the idea. Will David conquer Goliath this time around? Well, that's ultimately up to the players to decide.